The following history of the Hyksos people was written by Joshua T. Whaley. The history of the Hyksos people in Egypt is one of migration, cultural interplay, conquest, adaptation, and eventual expulsion, and it remains one of the most fascinating and debated periods in the long story of the Nile Valley. The Hyksos, a term derived from the Egyptian Heka Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands, refers to a group of people from the Levant, most likely of mixed West Asian Semitic origin, who during the Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650–1550 BCE, managed to establish dominion over parts of northern Egypt. Their arrival, ascendancy, and ultimate ouster by resurgent Egyptian forces reshaped the trajectory of the ancient world and left an indelible mark on Egyptian identity, kingship, and military organization. To understand how the Hyksos first found themselves in Egypt, one must look toward the gradual and complex processes of migration, trade, and intermittent settlement that had been occurring for centuries before the Hyksos ever ruled as pharaohs. The eastern Nile Delta was a region of cultural osmosis, an area where the Egyptian state interacted, both peacefully and violently, with its neighbors from the Sinai and the wider Levant. Archaeological evidence suggests that as early as the late Middle Kingdom, c. 1800 BCE, there was an increasing influx of Asiatic peoples into the delta, arriving as traders, laborers, mercenaries, and pastoralists. Sites such as Tel el-Dab'a, ancient Avaris, the future Hyksos capital, reveal layers of material culture that blend Egyptian and Levantine traditions, including pottery, weapons, and burial customs, all of which showing that a significant population of non-Egyptians had become part of the social fabric there. The reasons for this influx are manifold. Environmental stresses, such as droughts in the Levant, may have pushed groups westward in search of new opportunities. The prosperity of Middle Kingdom Egypt made it a magnet for those seeking employment or refuge. The Egyptians themselves appear to have encouraged, or at least tolerated, the settlement of Asiatics in the delta, perhaps to help cultivate or protect its lands, which were less tightly administered than the heartland of Upper Egypt. Over time, these communities grew in size and influence, retaining elements of their cultural heritage while adapting to their new home. Before we continue, if you like this video and support what this channel is doing, please click the like button and then subscribe to the channel. Now back to the story. The rise of the Hyksos to power was not a singular event, but a gradual process precipitated by ongoing immigration, growing local power bases, and the eventual political fragmentation of Egypt itself. By the late 13th dynasty, Egypt's centralized authority was unraveling. The Middle Kingdom, once strong and united, was beset by internal problems such as succession disputes, economic difficulties, and the weakening of the central administration, leading the power structure failing to maintain its grip on the delta. The eastern delta became semi-autonomous, with local rulers of Asiatic origin accumulating power. Eventually, one of these rulers, whose historical identity remains debated, but who is often named Salitis in Manetho's later account, consolidated control over Avaris and began to expand his influence. The process by which the Hyksos came to dominate Lower Egypt involved both military prowess and strategic alliances. The Hyksos were notable for their introduction and skilled use of new military technologies, including the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. These innovations revolutionized warfare in the Nile Valley, giving the Hyksos a decisive edge over the less mobile Egyptian armies. The rapid movement and striking power of chariotry allowed the Hyksos to overrun or intimidate their rivals, and their fortified settlements in the delta provided strongholds from which to project authority. Once established in Avaris, the Hyksos extended their control over the delta and much of northern Egypt, forming what would be known as the 15th dynasty. Their rule was not simply one of conquest and oppression, it was a period marked by the creation of a new hybrid society. The Hyksos rulers adopted Egyptian royal titulary, inscribed their names in cartouches, and made offerings to Egyptian gods, particularly Seth, a deity associated with both chaos and foreignness, but who became their royal patron. They also maintained many Egyptian administrative practices and employed native elites in their bureaucracy. Simultaneously, they preserved aspects of their own heritage, as evidenced by the presence of Levantine deities, pottery styles, and burial customs in Avaris and other sites. The Hyksos economy was robust and cosmopolitan, reflecting both their Levantine origins and Egyptian foundations. Avaris became the economic nerve center of the delta, its strategic location at the mouth of the delta and near the land routes to the Sinai and the Levant, making it a key hub for international trade. Archaeological finds at Tel el-Daba reveal a dazzling array of imported goods, such as Cypriot and Minoan pottery, Canaanite wares, precious metals, faience and glass. The Hyksos facilitated and perhaps monopolized the trade in luxury goods, copper and other resources between Egypt, the Levant, and even points farther east. Their ties to the broader Near Eastern world were a source of both wealth and political support. Agriculture remained the backbone of the Hyksos economy, as in all of Egypt, but there were notable differences in land tenure and labor. The delta marshlands, less intensively cultivated than the Nile Valley farther south, were opened up for settlement and agriculture, often by new immigrant communities. Livestock, particularly horses, cattle and sheep, were important sources of wealth, and the Hyksos appear to have practiced animal husbandry on a larger scale than their Egyptian contemporaries. The introduction of the horse transformed both warfare and transport, and the Hyksos are credited with establishing stables and breeding programs that would have a lasting impact on Egypt. The period of Hyksos rule was a time of profound disruption and adaptation for the Egyptian population. The traditional seat of pharaonic power, Upper Egypt, was never fully under Hyksos control. Instead, the native Egyptian dynasties, particularly those ruling from Thebes, maintained a kind of uneasy coexistence with the northern, foreign kings. There were periods of conflict and of peace, with some evidence of diplomatic marriages and treaties. The Theban rulers styled themselves as legitimate heirs to the ancient pharaonic tradition and regarded the Hyksos as usurpers, though the reality on the ground was more nuanced. For the ordinary Egyptian, life under Hyksos rule could vary widely, depending on geography and social status. In the Delta, the blending of cultures produced new forms of art and architecture. Administrative documents found at Tel el-Daba show that Egyptian scribes continued their work and temples were maintained. In Upper Egypt, resistance to foreign rule became a central theme of royal ideology, and the Theban kings increasingly portrayed themselves as champions of national liberation. Yet economic links between north and south persisted throughout most of the period, with goods and people moving up and down the Nile. The Hyksos minted no coins, but seals and scarabs bearing their names have been found widely, testifying to their administrative reach. Now, let's delve into the Hyksos' expulsion from Egypt. The Egyptian reconquest of the Delta and the expulsion of the Hyksos were the result of both long-term resistance and a series of military campaigns conducted by the Theban 17th dynasty. The drive to restore Egyptian rule became the central project of Theban kings such as Seqenenre-Ptah, Kamose, and most notably, Ahmose I. Our understanding of these campaigns is based on a mix of archaeological evidence, later written records, and the occasional propagandistic royal inscription. The first moves toward reconquest began under Seqenenre-Ptah, whose mummy, discovered in the 19th century, shows gruesome head wounds, evidence of his death in battle or assassination during the war with the Hyksos. His son, Kamose, left a stela at Thebes, recounting his campaign against the Asiatics, that is, the Hyksos, describing attacks on their strongholds and the disruption of their supply lines. Kamose's military efforts were bold but not decisive. The final victory would fall to his successor, Ahmose I. Ahmose launched a series of systematic campaigns that eventually overwhelmed the Hyksos' strongholds in the Delta. The siege of Avaris, as recounted in later traditions, was a prolonged and bloody affair. The Egyptians, by this point, had adopted many of the military technologies introduced by their adversaries, including the chariot and composite bow, leveling the playing field. The tomb biography of Ahmosi, son of Ibana, a Theban soldier, describes the battles for avarice and the pursuit of the fleeing Hyksos. According to the inscription, Ahmose fought bravely in the retaking of the city and was rewarded with the spoils of victory. The Hyksos, recognizing their untenable position, retreated from the delta, falling back on their remaining fortresses in the northeastern frontier. The Egyptians pursued them to Sharuhen, a major Hyksos stronghold in southern Canaan, besieging the city for 3 years before finally capturing it. This campaign not only ended Hyksos' rule in Egypt, but also extended Egyptians' military reach deep into the Levant, marking the start of the New Kingdom's era of imperial expansion. The expulsion of the Hyksos was both a military and an ideological event. The triumph was celebrated in Egyptian texts and art as the restoration of order, justice, and legitimate kingship, after a period of chaos and foreign domination. The Theban rulers sought to erase the memory of Hyksos kings, but the practical impact of their rule endured. The innovations in warfare, administration, and diplomacy introduced during the Hyksos period became permanent features of Egyptian civilization. The journey of the expelled Hyksos back to the Levant is less well documented, but archaeological and textual evidence enables some reconstruction. The main route led northeast out of the delta, through the Sinai, and into southern Canaan. The siege and fall of Sharuhen, as described in Ahmose's biography, suggest that many of the Hyksos elite and their followers sought refuge in this fortified city. The eventual destruction of Sharuhen likely scattered the survivors throughout the Levant. There is some speculation that the memory of the Hyksos expulsion survived in later Levantine traditions, perhaps even contributing to stories found in the Hebrew Bible concerning migrations from Egypt. The archaeological record shows a rise in fortified settlements in southern Canaan during the late Second Intermediate period, which may be connected to these population movements. However, the identification of specific sites or peoples as Hyksos after their expulsion is problematic, and much remains uncertain. Our knowledge of the Hyksos in Egypt rests on a combination of archaeological discoveries and written records, both Egyptian and, to a lesser extent, foreign. The principal site is Tel el-Daba, ancient Avaris, where extensive excavations have revealed a city of impressive size, complexity, and diversity. The remains include palaces, temples, tombs, workshops, and stables, as well as streets lined with houses in both Egyptian and Levantine styles. Finds of pottery, seals, scarabs, and luxury goods attest to the city's wealth and its connections with the outside world. Material evidence from Avaris and other delta sites shows the distinctive cultural blend that characterized Hyksos Egypt. Burials of horses, unknown in earlier Egyptian contexts, are a hallmark of the Hyksos, underscoring their equestrian expertise. Weapons and armor, including composite bows and chariot fittings, further illustrate their martial prowess. The presence of Canaanite-style temples, as well as shrines to Egyptian gods, reflects the religious pluralism of the period. Written records are more fragmentary, but significant. The Royal Canon of Turin lists the Hyksos kings as dynasts, albeit foreign. Inscriptions from the Theban rulers, such as the Kamose Stela and the two autobiographies of soldiers, provide a narrative of resistance and eventual victory. The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing centuries later in the Ptolemaic period, offered a detailed, if polemical, account of the Hyksos, portraying them as violent invaders who oppressed Egypt and were later expelled. While Manetho's history is colored by later attitudes, it preserves valuable traditions and names, such as Salitis, and references to Hyksos titles and cities. Foreign records concerning the Hyksos are few. Cuneiform tablets from Mari and other Near Eastern sites refer to rulers or envoys from Egypt, but it is difficult to match these references precisely to the Hyksos period. No clear record exists in the Levantine archaeological record of a Hyksos migration, though cultural parallels, such as the spread of chariot technology, pottery styles, and fortification methods, reflect the enduring impact of the Hyksos period. In summary, the story of the Hyksos in Egypt is that of a people who entered the delta as migrants and settlers in a time of prosperity and opportunity, rose to power amid the decline of central authority, and established a vibrant, cosmopolitan kingdom that connected Egypt with the wider world. Their mastery of chariot warfare and their sophisticated economy made them formidable rulers, but also left them vulnerable to the resurgent nationalism of the Theban pharaohs. Their expulsion was violent and total, reshaping not only Egypt, but also the Levant. The legacy of the Hyksos endures in the archaeology of avarice, the echoes of technological and cultural innovation, and in the historical imagination of Egypt and its neighbors. Their time in Egypt was relatively brief, about a century, but its consequences were profound, setting the stage for Egypt's new kingdom and the age of empire that followed. The fusion of Egyptian and Levantine cultures during the Hyksos era enriched both regions, even as the trauma of foreign rule fueled the Egyptian quest for unity and identity in the centuries to come. And now that we know the official record, let's cover the connection to the Book of Exodus. The question of whether the Hyksos expulsion served as the seed for the Exodus narrative has long fascinated historians, archaeologists, and biblical scholars. While certainty remains elusive, the parallels between the Hyksos' dramatic departure from Egypt and the biblical account of a mass exodus have provided fertile ground for speculation. At the heart of this connection is the memory of a foreign group ascending to prominence in Egypt, wielding significant power, and then being violently ousted by native rulers who claimed to restore divine order. Egyptian texts describe the Hyksos as foreigners who ruled unjustly and were subsequently expelled in an act of national purification. This motif resonates strongly with the biblical portrayal of the Israelites as outsiders who, after a period of hardship and strife, are driven out following climactic events that reaffirm the dominance and legitimacy of the Egyptian state. The Hyksos' origin in the Levant, their eventual migration into the Delta, and their establishment of a distinct yet syncretic culture mirror the general shape of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt as told in the Hebrew Bible. Both groups are characterized as Semitic-speaking peoples with ties to Canaan, and both stories culminate in a forced departure from Egypt, followed by perilous wanderings in the wilderness, and ultimately, a return to the Levant. In the case of the Hyksos, the archaeological evidence of their movement, leaving behind monumental fortifications at Avaris and Sharuhen, and perhaps dispersing throughout southern Canaan, parallels the biblical imagery of a migrant people traversing the desert and settling in the land beyond Egypt's borders. Further, the trauma and ideological impact of the Hyksos rule left an indelible mark on Egyptian national consciousness. Later Egyptian sources, particularly those composed centuries after the events, amplify the narrative of foreign domination and redemptive expulsion. Manetho, the Egyptian priest writing in Greek during the Ptolemaic period, gives an account in which the Hyksos are vilified, labeled as impure invaders, and cast out by a heroic pharaoh. Manetho's description, though polemical and filtered through the anxieties of later ages, bears striking thematic resemblance to the Exodus, where the pharaoh's hardening heart and the divine plagues precede the liberation of the oppressed. Some scholars have argued that Manetho's account, which was known to Josephus and other Jewish writers, may have directly influenced the shaping of the Exodus story in Second Temple Judaism. Material culture from the Hyksos period also hints at continuities with later Levantine societies. The introduction of new technologies, such as the horse-drawn chariot and composite bow, as well as the construction of Canaanite-style temples and the use of Levantine pottery, suggest a blending of peoples and traditions along the Egyptian-Levantine frontier. This cultural setting could have contributed to a collective memory in the southern Levant of an ancestral break in Egypt, followed by dramatic escape and resettlement. The memory of the fall of cities like Sharuhen and the scattering of Hyksos elites and their followers may have persisted in fragmented oral traditions for generations. Yet the transformation of the Hyksos episode into the Exodus narrative also involved significant reinterpretation. The biblical Exodus is emphatically a story of liberation from slavery, divine intervention, and the forging of a chosen people. Egyptian records do not present the Hyksos as enslaved, but as rulers whose expulsion followed decades of contentious coexistence. Nevertheless, from the perspective of communities in Canaan, the trauma of defeat and forced migration could easily have been recast as a narrative of suffering and deliverance, particularly if later groups sought to legitimize their claims to the land or to articulate a collective identity rooted in a dramatic past. The lack of direct contemporary evidence linking the Hyksos to the Israelites does not diminish the possibility that the memory of their expulsion contributed important themes to the formation of the Exodus story. The enduring Egyptian hostility toward foreigners, the archetype of the oppressive pharaoh, the subject of divine retribution through plagues or disaster, and the idea of mass movement from Egypt to Canaan, all find their precursors in the historical and literary legacy of the Hyksos period. In sum, while the Hyksos and Israelites were not the same people, and while the Exodus as described in the Bible is a synthesis of history, myth, and memory, the shadow of the Hyksos expulsion looms large behind the text. The resonance of a Semitic group's rise, dominance, and eventual expulsion from Egypt, followed by a complex process of migration and cultural integration in the Levant, is too strong to ignore. Through generations of retelling and reinterpretation, the trauma of Egypt's second intermediate period and the ideological triumph of native restoration may have been woven into the fabric of the biblical Exodus, providing the ancient Near East with one of its most enduring and powerful stories. But the question we must now cover is, who was the ruler of the Hyksos during their expulsion? King Apopis, also known as Apepi or Apophis, stands as one of the most prominent rulers of the Hyksos, the Semitic-speaking dynasty that seized power over northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, around the 16th century BCE. Apopis ruled from the city of Avaris, the Hyksos capital nestled in the eastern delta, and his reign is attested in both Egyptian inscriptions and later historical traditions. Noted for his political acumen and the expansion of Hyksos' power, Apopis is often considered the last great sovereign of his line, presiding during a time of intense conflict with the resurgent Theban dynasties of Upper Egypt. Apopis is remembered not only for his military campaigns and diplomatic efforts, but also for his distinctive cultural imprint. Under his rule, the Hyksos court retained strong ties to their Levantine origins, evident in the architecture, burial customs, and imported artifacts found at Avaris, while simultaneously adopting and adapting numerous elements of Egyptian practice to legitimize their authority. Apopis appears in Egyptian records as a formidable opponent, one who challenged the traditional order and provoked vigorous responses from native rulers, striving to unify Egypt under their rule once more. The possible connection between King Apopis and Moses, the central figure of the Exodus narrative, resides more in the realm of historical interpretation and mythic resonance than in concrete evidence. Some early scholars and writers, seeking to anchor biblical stories in the shifting realities of ancient Egypt, have speculated about links between the Hyksos period and the biblical account of Israelite enslavement and liberation. In these theories, Apopis is sometimes cast as a model for the Pharaoh of Exodus, a foreign ruler presiding over a mixed cosmopolitan Egypt, whose eventual downfall is remembered as a pivotal moment of national restoration for the Egyptians and of dramatic departure for the Semitic population. The similarities that fuel such speculation are layered and complex. Apopis, like the biblical Pharaoh, is portrayed as a powerful but embattled ruler facing internal dissent and external opposition. The expulsion of the Hyksos, orchestrated by Theban kings such as Ahmose I, involved the violent removal and dispersal of a Semitic-speaking elite and their followers, echoing the mass migration motif central to the Exodus. Furthermore, Manetho, the Egyptian priest historian writing in Greek centuries later, gives an account of the Hyksos as shepherd kings who were cast out of Egypt and migrated into the Levant, a narrative that early Jewish and Christian writers, including Josephus, sometimes associated with the Israelites. Despite these parallels, crucial differences remain. Apopis and the Hyksos were rulers, not slaves, and their expulsion was the result of a protracted military struggle rather than miraculous intervention. Egyptian texts, when describing Apopis and his contemporaries, emphasize their foreignness and the threat they pose to divine order, but do not mention a figure analogous to Moses, a leader calling for liberation, acting as a prophet, or performing wonders. The biblical Moses emerges from a very different literary and theological tradition, one that recasts the trauma of forced migration and national humiliation as a narrative of deliverance and chosen destiny. Nevertheless, it is conceivable that the collective memory of Apopis's reign, his court's prominence, and the dramatic end of Hyksos' rule could have contributed motifs and themes to the later development of the Exodus story. The Hyksos' expulsion marked a moment of profound crisis and transformation, remembered by Egyptians as the cleansing of the land from foreign rule, and by the peoples of the Levant perhaps as a movement filled with hardship and hope for renewal. In this cross-cultural remembering, the figure of Apopis could have become enveloped in the shadow of biblical pharaohs, his legacy less that of an individual and more of an archetype symbolizing the ambivalent relationship between Egypt and its Semitic populations. Ultimately, while there is no direct evidence to identify King Apopis as the pharaoh of the Exodus, or to link him personally to Moses, the echoes of his reign linger in the historical imagination. The stories of Hyksos' power and expulsion, filtered through generations of retelling and reinterpretation, may well have shaped the narrative contours of Exodus in ways that remain both elusive and suggestive, a testament to the enduring fascination with the complex interplay of myth, history, and memory at the heart of the ancient world. But who was this man known as Moses? The narratives of Moses and Sargon of Akkad, though separated by centuries and cultural boundaries, present strikingly similar motifs in their respective origin stories. Both tales revolve around a foundling child cast adrift on the waters, rescued and raised in the House of Power, and ultimately becoming a pivotal leader of their people. This literary parallel has fascinated historians, biblical scholars, and students of mythology alike, prompting questions about the transmission of storytelling themes and the mechanisms of cultural memory in the ancient Near East. Moses, as described in the Hebrew Bible, Exodus 2:1-10, is born into a world of oppression. Pharaoh, fearing the growing numbers and potential influence of the Israelites, decrees that all newborn Hebrew boys must be killed. Moses' mother, seeking to save her child, places the infant in a papyrus basket and sets him among the reeds of the Nile. The infant is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who takes pity and raises him as her own within the royal household. Thus, Moses is both an outsider and an insider, born of the oppressed, nourished by the powerful, and destined to challenge the very regime that sheltered him. Sargon, of Akkad's origin myth, recorded in a cuneiform text known as the Sargon legend, found in the Ashurbanipal library at Nineveh, presents an equally evocative narrative. Sargon claims, "My mother, the high priestess, conceived me. She bore me in secret. She set me in a basket of reeds, sealed it with bitumen, and cast me into the river. The river carried me to Aki, the drawer of water, who took me as his son and raised me." Sargon too moves from obscurity to power, ultimately founding the Akkadian Empire and ruling as one of Mesopotamia's most legendary kings. In both stories, the child's birth is considered illicit or dangerous. Moses, because of the legal edict demanding his death. Sargon, because his mother cannot keep him openly due to her status as a priestess. Both mothers resort to subterfuge, the concealment and eventual abandonment of the child on a river, encased in a waterproofed vessel. The keynote of the river, as both a place of peril and deliverance is central. In each case, the child is found and nurtured by someone associated with the ruling class. Moses by the daughter of Pharaoh, Sargon by Aki, who is of sufficient stature to provide for the child and facilitate his future ascension. These parallel elements suggest a widely circulated story structure in the ancient Near East, one that underscores themes of hidden birth, miraculous survival, and divine or fated leadership. The resonance of this narrative may reflect shared anxieties and hopes in societies marked by political upheaval, questions of legitimacy, and the possibilities of social mobility. At the same time, the stories diverge in significant respects. Moses' tale is explicitly framed as an act of resistance and fulfillment of divine promise, whereas Sargon's narrative emphasizes kingly destiny and the mystery of royal origins. The written confirmation of these stories is itself a subject of scholarly discussion. The earliest extant version of Sargon's birth legend dates to the late 3rd millennium BCE, with copies surviving from the Old Babylonian period, 19th-17th centuries BCE, and later in the 7th century BCE from Ashurbanipal's library, where the Akkadian text was recopied and preserved. The story, however, is generally understood to reflect pre-literate traditions about Sargon dating back to his own reign, traditionally placed around 2334, 2279 BCE. The oldest written record of Moses comes from the Hebrew Bible itself, specifically the Book of Exodus, whose current literary form is believed by most scholars to have been compiled no earlier than the 7th or 6th century BCE, though oral traditions may be older. The earliest physical manuscript fragments, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, date to the 2nd century BCE, but the story's composition and redaction likely stretch back to the monarchic or early exilic periods of ancient Israelite history. Thus, the Sargon legend predates the biblical account of Moses by at least a millennium in written form, and its themes may have circulated widely through oral and literary traditions in the intervening centuries. This temporal and cultural gap has fueled the hypothesis that the Moses narrative, or aspects of it, were shaped or inspired by older Mesopotamian stories, adapted to local contexts and theological purposes. While direct borrowing cannot be irrefutably demonstrated, the similarities between the origin stories of Moses and Sargon of Akkad testify to the enduring power of foundational myths that weave together the precariousness of birth, the intervention of fate or divinity, and the emergence of transformative leadership from the humblest beginnings. These ancient stories, preserved in cuneiform and in the biblical text, continue to resonate as archetypes of deliverance, destiny, and the mysterious pathways by which leaders arise in the world. Anyway, beyond the well-known birth legend, several episodes in the life of Moses echo themes and patterns found in older traditions and historical figures of the ancient Near East and beyond. One notable example is the motif of the lawgiver ascending a sacred mountain to receive divine instruction or revelation. In the Exodus narrative, Moses climbs Mount Sinai to commune directly with God and receive the commandments, returning to the people as a mediator bearing sacred laws. This theme has deep precedence in ancient culture. For instance, the Sumerian king Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi of Babylon were each depicted as receiving laws or codes from deities, Ur-Nammu from the moon god Nana and Hammurabi from Shamash, the sun god, often portrayed in art as standing before the god to accept a rod or tablet of justice. Such imagery reinforces the concept of laws descending from a divine source to establish order in human society, with the king or leader serving as an intermediary. Another parallel emerges in the figure of the prophet and miracle worker. Moses' transformation of the Nile's waters, the plague narratives, and his ability to summon food and water in the desert reflect the traditions of magicians and holy individuals from earlier civilizations. In Egypt, magicians and priests were believed to wield supernatural power, and stories circulated of wise men, such as Imhotep, performing wonders or providing divine guidance during times of crisis. In Mesopotamian myth, Semi-divine kings and sages like Adapa and Gilgamesh had close relationships with the gods, interceding on behalf of humanity, and sometimes engaging in contests or demonstrations of power before rulers. The theme of exodus or liberation under a charismatic leader is also found in the stories of Sumerian and Akkadian rulers. Sargon of Akkad, beyond his birth, claimed to have unified disparate peoples and led them out of subjugation, establishing a new order. In Egypt, tales of the expulsion of the Hyksos, or the journeys of divine children, often frame their protagonists as liberators or restorers of rightful rule, acting under divine guidance or destiny. Other traditions portray wise counselors who mediate between a deity and a people in distress. Figures like Joseph, whose story in Egypt predates Moses in the biblical narrative, share elements of interpreting dreams, averting disasters, and negotiating with rulers on behalf of a foreign people. In both the Joseph and Moses stories, the motif of a foreigner rising to prominence in the Egyptian court and later delivering their people is evident, echoing a wider literary tradition in which outsiders become essential agents of change. Taken together, these overlapping patterns suggest that the story of Moses did not arise in isolation, but was shaped by a vast reservoir of mythic and historical writings circulating throughout the ancient world. Rather than a simple case of borrowing, these stories may represent the dynamic adaptation of archetypal themes, those of the lawgiver, the wonder worker, the mediator, and the liberator, to the particular theological and social concerns of the Israelites. In retelling and reshaping such stories, the Moses narrative achieves both continuity with deep-rooted human storytelling and a distinctive voice in the biblical tradition. In conclusion, the deep parallels between the stories of Moses and Sargon of Akkad, highlighting how ideas of hidden birth, miraculous survival, and divinely inspired leadership recur across ancient Near Eastern traditions. By tracing the written histories and oral legacies of these figures, the analysis reveals that such foundational myths were shaped by centuries of cultural exchange, adaptation, and reinterpretation. The Moses narrative, in particular, emerges not in isolation, but as a creative reworking of widespread archetypes. The lawgiver who ascends the sacred mountain, the wonder worker who mediates between humanity and the divine, and the liberator who leads people to freedom. These enduring themes reflect society's hopes and anxieties about legitimacy, leadership, and deliverance, and their resonance continues to shape collective memory across generations. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you would truly like to support the author, Joshua, or wish to learn more about humanity's hidden history, you can purchase your copy of Forbidden Genesis, The Untold Story of Man Today. The link is in the description box below. Thank you so much for your time.